If you're listening to this, you may drift off before the end. So before you do, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Before we start, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes. Just relax, take a deep breath, and let everything go. Good night. Now we can begin. It was a cold, drizzly evening when I first discovered the bookstore. A small alleyway, hidden between two towering buildings, led me to a door that shouldn't have existed. The wooden frame was ancient, its dark oak worn smooth by time. Above it, a hanging sign swayed gently in the wind, its golden lettering barely legible beneath a layer of dust and cobwebs. The Library of Unwritten Deaths. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced back at the street behind me, the city bustling with life, cars honking, neon lights flickering. Yet here in this narrow alley, everything was still, too still. Curiosity tugged at me. I shouldn't have gone in. I know that now. But something about the place pulled me forward, as if my own feet were making the decision for me. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. The scent of old parchment and ink filled the air, mingled with something else, something damp, like soil freshly turned after rain. Rows upon rows of bookshelves stretched far beyond what seemed possible for such a small building. The store had a strange, dreamlike quality, the kind where you question if you're awake or trapped in a memory long forgotten. The lighting was dim, the glow of flickering lanterns casting eerie shadows along the spines of books. And then I noticed something odd. Unlike any other bookstore, these books had no titles on their spines. No authors, just simple, unmarked covers in varying shades of black and gray. I reached for one. The moment my fingers brushed the spine, a voice whispered behind me, "That book isn't yours to read." I spun around, my heart hammering. A woman stood there. She was impossibly tall, draped in a long, charcoal gray coat that blended seamlessly into the shadows. Her eyes, dark as ink, studied me with quiet intensity. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice unsteady. She ignored my question, stepping closer. "Every book here contains the unwritten death of someone who has yet to meet their end," she said. "This is not a place for idle curiosity." I swallowed hard. The weight of her words settled into my bones. "Then why is it open?" I asked, glancing around. "If people aren't meant to find it." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. "Some are drawn here for a reason." A chill ran through me. Then my gaze fell on a single book, resting on a nearby table. And like the others, this one had something scrawled on the cover in golden ink. My breath caught in my throat. It was my name. I reached for it before I could stop myself. The moment I did, the bookstore around me seemed to sigh, like a great, unseen presence had just woken up. The woman's expression darkened. "You shouldn't have done that," she murmured. I looked down. The book, previously closed, had begun to write itself. Page after page, my death was being written before my very eyes. And the last sentence, ink still wet, made my blood run cold. "The moment he reads these words, he is no longer safe." The book trembled in my hands, its pages shifting like they were alive. My name was scrawled across the front in golden ink. And now, the words inside were forming faster than I could comprehend. "The moment he reads these words, he is no longer safe." My breath hitched. The ink wasn't dry. It glistened under the dim lantern light, as if the words had just been written. By whom, or by what? I snapped the book shut and took a step back. The woman in the long gray coat hadn't moved. She stood as still as a statue, watching me with those unfathomable black eyes. I licked my lips, trying to steady my voice. What does this mean?" Her gaze flickered toward the book, then back to me. "It means you've seen too much." A deep chill ran through me. The store was silent, but not the comforting kind of quiet you find in libraries. This silence was heavy, like the air before a storm. I glanced around at the endless rows of bookshelves. There were thousands of them, no titles, no authors, just untold stories waiting to be read. And if this place truly contained unwritten deaths, did that mean my fate was still changing? Could I stop whatever had begun the moment I touched this book? I looked back at the woman. Can I put it back? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Would it matter? Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I turned the book over in my hands. The cover felt strangely warm, almost pulsing beneath my fingertips. A part of me wanted to fling it across the room, but another part, the part that had led me here in the first place, was desperate to know more. I hesitated, then flipped the book open again. The words were still forming. His hands trembled as he turned the page, unaware that he was being watched. A loud creak sounded from the back of the store. I froze. The woman didn't react. She simply stared at me, unblinking. My pulse thundered in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. The store stretched far beyond where it should have ended, the bookshelves fading into darkness. But just beyond the edge of the lantern light, I could see something. A figure, tall, motionless, watching me. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any details, but I felt its eyes on me. And then, without a sound, it moved. A single step forward. My breath came short and fast. Who's there? No answer, just silence. I turned back to the woman. What is that? I whispered. She didn't respond. The book burned in my hands. I looked down. The words had changed again. If he runs, it will follow. I clenched my jaw. My whole body screamed at me to move, but my mind knew better. If this book was predicting my actions, it meant I had already made my choice. The moment I ran, I didn't let myself finish the thought. I forced myself to stay still, locking my muscles in place. The figure in the shadows shifted. Its head tilted ever so slightly, as if it were curious. The air felt thick, heavy. Then, the woman finally spoke. This is why you shouldn't have picked it up. My grip tightened on the book. Then tell me what to do. She studied me for a moment, then sighed. There's only one way to stop it now. I waited. You have to finish the story. My breath caught. What? She gestured toward the book. If you don't, it will keep writing itself. Your death will remain unwritten, shifting, changing, until it finds the worst possible ending. My stomach twisted. And if I do finish it, her expression darkened. Then the ending becomes real. The figure took another step forward. I swallowed hard. My fingers trembled as I stared down at the book in my hands. Write my own fate, or let it be written for me. Either way, I wasn't getting out of this unscathed. The air inside the library felt wrong, thick, weighted, as if the entire space was pressing down on me. The woman's words rang in my head, looping like a slow, creeping horror I couldn't shake. You have to finish the story. But how? How could I possibly write an ending when I didn't even know how it began? The book in my hands felt heavier than before, as if it had absorbed the weight of my fear. I forced myself to glance at the open page. The words had shifted again. He held the book tightly, not yet realizing it wasn't the only thing holding on to him. A sharp prickle ran down my spine. My breath stilled. The woman's gaze flickered toward my shoulder. Don't move. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to do the opposite. But her voice, cold, steady, rooted me in place. I felt it then, a sensation like ice-cold fingers pressing against the back of my neck. Light at first, then firm, as if something unseen was testing the boundary between presence and possession. A whisper too close to my ear, a breath that wasn't mine. You are in my story now. My heart slammed against my ribs. My body fought the urge to twist away, to swat at whatever was touching me. But the woman's eyes were sharp, her head giving the faintest shake. Don't react. I forced my breathing to slow, locking every muscle into place. If I moved, if I acknowledged it, the whisper slithered closer. You don't get to choose the ending. A cold rush slid down my spine, then just as quickly as it came, the touch disappeared. The air snapped back into place, and I gasped, stepping away as if I'd been burned. My knees felt weak, my hands unsteady as I gripped the book. The woman didn't look surprised. She simply exhaled, her expression unreadable. You're running out of time. I forced my voice to work. What was that? Her gaze moved past me, toward the endless bookshelves, toward the darkness beyond the dim glow of the lanterns. The author, she murmured, the blood drained from my face. What? She gestured toward the book, still clutched in my hands. Every story here is unwritten until someone reads it, and once it's opened, her voice dipped lower, the author wakes up. A slow, suffocating dread settled over me. I stared down at the book, at the shifting words, the ink that glistened like fresh wounds. The author wakes up. And now it knew I was here. I turned back to the woman, my voice unsteady. Then how do I stop it? Her lips pressed into a thin line. I already told you. I swallowed hard, finished the story, but what if the author didn't want me to? I looked down at the page again, half expecting new words to have appeared. They had. He turned the page, knowing the next words would decide whether he lived or died. The library was silent, the air thick with expectation. I hesitated, then turned the page. The ink bled into existence, forming words faster than my mind could process. He wasn't alone anymore. A shadow moved between the shelves. My pulse stopped, not the woman, not the flicker of lantern light. Something else, watching, waiting, a figure tall, impossibly thin, standing in the gap between two bookshelves. Its face was unreadable, a smear of darkness in the dim glow, but its head was tilted, just slightly, like it was considering me. The woman's voice was quiet. You have to move now. I didn't need to be told twice. With the book clutched in my hands, I took a step back, then another. The figure didn't move, but the air around it shifted, like the space itself was warping to keep it hidden. I turned to the woman, panic clawing up my throat. Where do I go? She glanced at the book, then at me. Where the story tells you to. I looked down. The words had changed again. He ran left, toward the only door that had been there all along. I sucked in a sharp breath. I didn't see a door, but the book had been right about everything else. I turned, and there it was. A door. It hadn't been there before, at least not until I read it. I had no time to question it. The shadow shifted again, closer this time, and I bolted. The door swung open the moment I reached for it. The second I crossed the threshold, the library vanished behind me. And then darkness. I stumbled forward, expecting to hit solid ground, but instead I was falling. Not far, just enough for my stomach to lurch before my feet slammed against something cold and unsteady. I barely caught myself, my hands scraping against a rough surface as the door behind me vanished, gone. I spun, my breath coming fast. The library was no longer there. No shelves, no lanterns, no shadowy figure watching from the darkness. Just this place, a dimly lit room. I steadied myself, eyes scanning my surroundings. The walls were made of aged stone, damp and uneven, like the inside of an ancient cellar. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. Rust, no, blood. A shiver crawled down my spine. The only source of light came from a flickering oil lamp mounted on the far wall. It barely illuminated the space, casting long, jittering shadows that made the walls seem closer than they actually were. I took a slow, careful breath. Where was I? And more importantly, why did the book send me here? The floor beneath me was uneven, covered in what felt like old wooden planks, warped and weak from years of dampness. I glanced down. That was when I saw it, the book, still clutched in my hands, its ink shifting, twisting, as if alive. I hesitated before looking at the page. He found himself in the room that shouldn't exist. My throat tightened. The book had been eerily accurate before, so why did that sentence feel so much worse than the others? I turned another page, my fingers trembling. He wasn't alone. A creaking sound. I froze, the kind of sound wood makes under pressure, like someone shifting their weight just slightly. Slow, deliberate, right behind me. I didn't breathe, didn't move, but I felt it. The presence, thick, heavy, pressing down on the air itself. Then another creak. Closer. I spun instinctively, my back pressing against the cold stone wall. My eyes darted across the room, searching. Who was there? The shadows shifted. My pulse thundered in my ears. I strained to see, to make sense of the dimly lit space. The oil lamp flickered wildly, casting erratic shapes that made my brain scream danger. And then something moved. Not a trick of the light, not my imagination. A figure, tall, wrong, standing in the far corner. Its features were obscured, swallowed by the shifting darkness. But I could make out one thing: it was watching me. I swallowed hard, gripping the book tighter. My fingers dug into the cover, my breath unsteady. I forced my voice to work. "Who are you?" No answer, not at first, then. A whisper, faint, just on the edge of hearing. "You shouldn't be here." The lamp flickered. For the briefest second, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. A smooth, featureless void where a face should be. Not empty, not hollow, just wrong. Something deep in my gut screamed run. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. I looked down at the book, flipping the page in desperation. He asked the wrong question. I barely had time to register the words before the whisper came again, closer now. "You don't belong in this story." The shadows shifted violently. A force slammed into me, cold and suffocating. My vision blurred as the room tilted, my head spinning. I was falling again, or maybe being pulled. The last thing I saw was the flickering light dying out completely, then darkness. I gasped as my back hit the ground. For a split second, I didn't know if I was falling, or if the world itself was shifting around me. My breath came in sharp, ragged gulps, and my fingers dug into something solid beneath me. Wood. Cold, rough, splintered. The air around me had changed. No more damp stone. No more flickering light. Silence, then a single distinct sound. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up fast. My heart beat a thunderous rhythm in my chest. My surroundings had changed yet again. Gone was the strange cellar with the faceless thing lurking in the dark. Instead, I was in a hallway, long, narrow, endless. The walls were made of old, cracked wood, warped from time, stretching far into the distance. A single light bulb flickered above, its glow barely reaching more than a few feet. The rest of the hallway was swallowed in shadows. And in front of me a door, massive, ancient, looking. It stood in the middle of the hallway as if it had always been there. The wood was blackened, scorched, as if it had been through a fire long ago. Its surface was covered in deep claw marks, as if something had tried to break out. Or worse, tried to keep something from getting in. My breathing slowed as I took it all in. The knocking had stopped. But the air still felt heavy, pressing down on me with an invisible weight. I looked down, the book. It was still in my hands, its ink shifting, forming new words before my eyes. I swallowed hard and read. He finds the door that should not exist. I barely had time to process it before the next line appeared, as if the book knew I was reading it, and then, he makes a choice. A choice. I forced myself to stand. My legs were unsteady, my fingers gripping the book like a lifeline. I had to get out of here. But where was here? I turned, expecting to see the way I had come. Nothing. Just more hallway, stretching impossibly far in either direction. No end, no doors, no sign of the cellar. Just this one single door. I licked my dry lips, my hand moving toward the rusted handle. Something deep inside me, some buried instinct, screamed not to touch it. But what choice did I have? I reached forward, and the knocking started again, loud, urgent. I jumped back, my pulse hammering. Someone, or something, was on the other side. My breathing turned shallow. I could feel something watching me, just beyond the wood. I wanted to run, to turn away and never look back. But the book wanted me to choose. I flipped the page with shaking fingers. If he opens the door, he steps into the unknown. I turn to the next line. If he walks away, the door will follow. A chill shot through me. I turned back to the door, staring at the claw marks, the scorched wood, the way the handle seemed to hum with energy. I stepped closer. I could hear breathing on the other side, slow, heavy, too deep to be human. My stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew the book was right. If I left this door behind, it wouldn't stay here. It would find me wherever I went, and next time I might not have the choice to open it. My fingers closed around the cold, rusted handle. I turned it, the door swung open, and I stepped through. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed through the dark, bouncing off unseen walls. I spun around, reaching for the handle, but there was no door anymore, just endless blackness stretching behind me. Panic clawed at my chest. I wasn't in the hallway anymore. I wasn't anywhere, but then, a light, dim, flickering, a single, bare bulb buzzed to life above me, casting a dull glow over the room I now stood in. And for the first time since entering the library of unwritten deaths, I wished I hadn't come this far. Because the room, it was filled with names. Every inch of the walls was covered in them, handwritten, carved, painted. Some scratched so deep into the wood they bled into the walls like open wounds. Hundreds. Thousands, maybe more. I stumbled back, my eyes darting across them. Some were neat, written in careful script. Others looked like they'd been carved in desperation, as if someone had used their own nails to scratch them into the surface. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A book, sitting on a wooden pedestal in the center of the room. Not just any book, my book, the same one I had been carrying, except it wasn't in my hands anymore. It was already open, and its pages were turning on their own. My heart hammered. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, drawn to it despite every part of me screaming to stop. The pages finally stilled, revealing a single, handwritten sentence in dark, shifting ink. He enters the room of forgotten names and finds his own waiting for him. I swallowed. Hard no, 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 no. I turned back to the walls, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I searched, and then I found it. My name, it was there, etched into the wood, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The ink still fresh, still wet. I reached out with trembling fingers. The moment I touched it, the walls shifted. The names began to move, the letters crawling, rearranging themselves like insects scurrying under the light. Some of them faded, vanishing into the wood. Others' new names began to appear, and then I heard the whispering. A low, hissing chorus that slithered through the air, coming from every direction at once. Who are you? I spun, my pulse racing. Who are you? The whispering grew louder, overlapping, pressing against my skull like invisible hands clawing at my mind. I backed away, but the room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in, the names pulsing like veins beneath the surface. Then the book flipped to a new page, a blank one, and before I could move, before I could run, my name began to write itself in the empty space. Letter by letter, and beneath it, a date, tomorrow. A shudder ran down my spine. I grabbed the book, my fingers trembling as I tried to slam it shut, but the ink kept writing, spilling onto the pages like a bleeding wound. At time, 1 minute before midnight, no, this wasn't possible. I was staring at the exact moment I was going to die. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was worse, because in that silence, something shifted behind me. Something big, something that had been watching me all along. I turned slowly, and I wasn't alone anymore. I turned slowly. The air had changed, thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere had turned into something alive, something breathing. And in the dim, flickering light, I saw it. A shadow, tall and unnatural, unfolding from the farthest corner of the room. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had words for. Its form was fluid, shifting between solid and smoke, as if it were both there and not there at the same time. But the worst part, it had no face, just a smooth, black void where one should be. And yet, I knew, it was watching me. I stepped back, my pulse hammering. The book in my hands felt like a weight, like it was pulling me toward it instead of the other way around. The moment I moved, the thing tilted its head, not fast, not aggressive, just studying, waiting. A deep, low whisper rolled through the room, but it didn't come from the thing in front of me. It came from the walls, from the names. The carved letters shuddered, twisting and shifting beneath the surface of the wood. Some disappeared, swallowed into the darkness. Others grew clearer, as if being rewritten in real time. And then, in a voice that wasn't my own, I heard a whisper behind me. "You shouldn't have come here." I whirled around. No one was there, but something had changed. The book. The page had turned again, and now, under my name and the time of my death, a new sentence had appeared. "It sees you now." I felt the air shift behind me, close, too close. A slow, deliberate breath brushed against my neck. I didn't think, I ran. The door, the one that had disappeared, was suddenly there again, flickering into existence like it had been waiting for me to look away. I lunged for it, gripping the handle with slippery, shaking fingers. It wouldn't turn. Behind me, the whispering grew louder. The walls trembled, the names rippled like water. I slammed my fist against the wood. "Let me out." And then the whispering stopped. The silence was so sharp it rang in my ears. I turned, and the thing, the shadow that had been watching me, was gone. For a second, I thought I was alone, but then I saw the names again, and mine was no longer alone. Another had appeared beneath it. A second name, written in the same shifting, bleeding ink. A name I recognized, someone I knew, someone alive. And beneath their name, the same death date as mine. Tomorrow. My stomach dropped. I wasn't the only one marked anymore. And whoever this was, whoever had been added to the book, they had no idea what was coming for them. I had to find them. I had to warn them. But as I reached for the book, the door swung open on its own. And on the other side, I wasn't in the library anymore. I was somewhere else entirely. I stumbled forward. The library was gone. Instead, I stood in the middle of a long, dimly lit hallway. But it wasn't a normal hallway. The walls were lined with bookshelves, just like the library, but these were different. Each shelf was taller than any building I'd ever seen, stretching endlessly upward, vanishing into shadows. And the books, they weren't books at all. They were names, bound in dark leather, arranged in perfect, unsettling order, each one embossed with a name in gold lettering. Some looked old, the letters fading and cracked. Others looked fresh, like they'd just been placed there. And then I saw it, the book with my name on it. It sat on the middle shelf, glowing faintly, as if calling me toward it. I reached out, my fingers barely grazing the spine, and then, a sound. A low creak echoed from somewhere deep in the hallway. A door was opening, but I hadn't seen any doors. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, dim and infinite, and then, suddenly, a door appeared. Right in the middle of the hallway. It hadn't been there before. It stood alone, not attached to anything, hovering in the darkness. And it was open. A deep, slow breath slipped from the crack, cold and damp, curling through the air like smoke. And then I heard it, a voice, a whisper, crawling out from the darkness behind the door. It spoke my name. And then another name, the same one I had just seen written under mine in the book. Whoever this person was, something was coming for them. And if I didn't move fast, it would find them first. The whispering didn't stop. It repeated my name, slow and deliberate, like something testing the weight of it. And then it spoke the other name again, the name that had appeared beneath mine in the book. A chill crawled up my spine. Who was this person? Why were our names linked? And why was I hearing it from the darkness behind that door? The air grew thick. My throat tightened. I didn't want to move closer, but something inside me pulled forward anyway. I had to know. I reached out just a little, just enough to see past the edge of the doorframe, and my stomach dropped. There was nothing behind the door, no walls, no floor, no ceiling, just darkness, a space that shouldn't exist. And then it moved, not the door, the darkness. It shifted, swirling like thick black smoke, stretching outward in unnatural, twitching tendrils. And inside it a shape, something lurking within the void, watching me. The whispering grew louder. It didn't just say my name anymore. Now it laughed. a slow, broken sound that didn't belong in this world. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering, but the door didn't let me go. The moment I moved away, it slammed shut on its own, and then disappeared. Just blinked out of existence like it had never been there at all. But the whispering, it was still inside my head. And now I could feel it, a presence, moving somewhere beyond the shelves, shifting between the towering books, watching me. It had let me go, for now, but it wasn't finished with me yet, and I knew. If I didn't find the person whose name was written with mine, neither of us would survive what was coming next. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, heart hammering like a distant drum. The air around me felt thick, charged with something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist in a place like this. My mind struggled to process what had just happened, the door that led to nowhere, the thing inside the darkness, and the way it had whispered my name as if it had known me long before I had ever stepped foot in this library. But there was something worse, the name written beneath mine in the book. I turned back to the table where the heavy, leather-bound tome still lay open, its brittle pages illuminated by the dim golden glow of the hanging lamps. My fingers trembled as I reached for it again, my skin cold despite the warmth in the air. The book felt different now, like something alive, something aware that I had seen too much. My name was still there, inked into the delicate fibers of the aged paper, but now, the name beneath it, the one that hadn't been there before, had changed. Or rather, it had become clearer. James Halloway. I didn't know the name. I had never heard it before. And yet, as I stared at it, an unshakable feeling of dread settled deep in my stomach. A low creak sounded from behind me, like the shifting weight of someone stepping forward. I turned too fast, nearly knocking the book from the table, but there was no one there. The library was still and silent, its endless aisles stretching out into impossible distances, the books watching me from their tightly packed rows. But I could feel something just out of sight, a presence that lingered at the edges of my vision, shifting whenever I tried to focus. I wasn't alone, and whoever, or whatever, was here with me, it knew the name too. A sudden gust of wind swept through the library, despite the fact that there were no open windows and no doors leading outside. The overhead lamps flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I swore I saw something. A silhouette standing between the shelves, unmoving, staring. When the light steadied, it was gone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my hands still clenched into fists at my sides. I needed to get out of here, needed to find someone who could tell me who James Halloway was, and why his name was written with mine in a book that had no business existing. But something told me I wouldn't be leaving just yet, not until I had uncovered the truth, and I had a terrible feeling that by the time I did, it would be too late. I left the book where it was, unwilling to touch it again. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but something kept my feet rooted in place. The library had felt strange before, but now it was different. The air felt heavier, the rows of bookshelves seemed closer, as if they were watching me, waiting. I took a slow, cautious step back, then another. A whisper drifted through the aisles, not a voice. Not exactly. It was more like the sound of pages turning, but too slow, too deliberate, like something was flipping through a book that didn't belong to it. I forced myself to look away from the book on the table and scan the rows ahead. The shelves were deep, stretching into shadow, their contents thick with dust. I didn't know what I was searching for, but I had the awful feeling that something was searching for me too. And then the lights flickered again, the shadows in the far aisle shifted, moved. A figure stood there, tall, motionless, featureless. The moment I saw it, my breath hitched in my throat. Every part of me froze, an instinctive terror crawling through my veins. It wasn't human, it wasn't right. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. Then it tilted its head. The library went dark. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then a voice, low, hollow, wrong. It spoke only 2 words, James Halloway. The lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. but the name still hung in the air, whispered by something that had no mouth, no form, no place in reality. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to be anywhere but here. The library's corridors stretched and twisted. There lay, out warping into something unfamiliar. The exit was gone. The door I had walked through was no longer there. I stopped, my breath coming in short gasps. And then, just ahead of me, the book. It was sitting in the middle of the aisle, waiting for me. The pages were open. The ink was still shifting, and beneath my name, James Halloway's name was no longer alone. Another had been added. My name again, but this time there was a date next to it. A date I recognized, tomorrow. My eyes locked onto the date written beside my name. Tomorrow, it shouldn't have been possible. The book wasn't supposed to predict the future. It recorded deaths that had already happened. That was the rule. That was what the old man had said. But there it was, in ink that still looked wet, as if it had just been written. I swallowed hard. My throat felt dry, my hands clammy. Tomorrow. It repeated in my mind like a drumbeat, steady and slow, each pulse of fear sinking deeper into my chest. What did it mean? How could I already be in the book if I was still alive? I reached for the book, hesitating as my fingers brushed the leather cover. It felt warm, like it had been sitting under the sun, but the library was cold, too cold. The lights overhead flickered again. The shadows stretched, shifting unnaturally along the walls. And then, just behind me, footsteps. Not soft, hesitant steps. No, these were deliberate, heavy, coming closer. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was no one there. Only the endless aisles, stretching in every direction. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't alone. I forced my eyes back to the book. My name, James Halloway's name, and now another date was appearing. Not tomorrow, tonight. The ink formed each number, slow and deliberate, like something unseen was writing it as I watched. My stomach twisted into a knot. I took a step back, then another, my breath quick and shallow. The whispering started again. The sound of pages turning. The shadows at the end of the aisle shifted, and then a figure stepped forward. It wasn't the old man. It wasn't a librarian. It was me. I choked on my own breath, my body locking in place. The figure standing in the dim light was an exact replica. Same height, same face, same wide-eyed look of horror. It opened its mouth, and in my own voice it whispered, "Run." The library went dark, and I did the only thing I could. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I didn't even check if the thing that looked like me was following. I just ran, twisting and turning through the aisles of books, desperate to find the entrance. The library was vast, but I remembered the way I had come. Didn't I? Left, then right, then another right. But when I turned the final corner, expecting to see the heavy wooden doors that led back into the world outside, they weren't there. My stomach lurched. The doors were gone. I spun around, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The shelves stretched on forever. The air smelled wrong. A mix of old paper and something damp, rotting. Behind me, the whispering started again. Pages turning. Footsteps mine, no, not mine. I forced myself forward, pressing deeper into the library, hoping, praying that another exit existed. My heart pounded against my ribs as I hurried past rows of books that no longer seemed familiar. The titles had changed. The names were different. The shelves themselves were shifting. A deep, low creak echoed through the space. Like the very foundation of the library was moving beneath me, and then I saw it, a door. It wasn't the one I had entered through, but at this point I didn't care. I ran toward it, gripping the handle with sweaty fingers and yanking it open. A stairwell. It led down. I hesitated. The air that drifted up from below was colder than it should have been, like opening the door of a walk-in freezer. My breath fogged in front of me, and for a second, I thought I heard something shifting in the darkness below. But then the lights flickered, and somewhere back in the aisles, something exhaled, low, deep, like a slow, deliberate breath filling unseen lungs. I had no choice. I stepped forward onto the stairs and pulled the door shut behind me. Darkness swallowed me whole. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the silence became unbearable. No more whispers, no more rustling pages, no shifting shelves, just the sound of my own breath, too loud in the narrow stairwell. I reached out, feeling along the wall for a light switch. Nothing. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the library behind me, seeping through the cracks in the door. I took a step down, then another. The cold deepened with each step. My fingers brushed the handrail. It was metal, but wet. I pulled my hand back, shivering at the slickness. It smelled faintly of iron. I swallowed hard. Down, down, down. The stairs wound in a spiral, vanishing into blackness. My footsteps echoed strangely, like the sound was being swallowed before it could travel too far. I counted each step. 15, 20, 30, still no end in sight. I turned, glancing back toward the door. It wasn't there anymore. Panic flared in my chest. I stumbled forward, gripping the railing again despite the dampness. The air had changed. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was dense, like stepping into a place that wasn't supposed to exist. Something shifted below, a scraping sound, slow, deliberate. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, a voice, low, whispering, just barely audible, "You shouldn't be here." I swallowed hard, my body refusing to move. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. The voice came again, closer now. "Turn back." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But there was no turning back. The library had erased the way out. So I did the only thing I could. I kept going, and whatever was waiting for me at the bottom was waiting no longer. The last step felt different. Colder, softer. I hesitated before placing my full weight down, my shoe sinking slightly into something damp. My breath hitched. I couldn't see anything in the suffocating dark, but I could feel it, the shift in the air. The weight of something close by, watching. I exhaled slowly, straining to listen. The stairwell above me was gone, vanished into a black void. There was no going back. I reached out cautiously. My fingers brushed against something solid, a door. I had no other choice. My hand trembled as I gripped the handle. It was warm, like something had just let go of it. A soft click echoed as I pushed it open. What lay beyond should not have been possible. It wasn't another room. It wasn't a basement or a secret archive. It was a vast, open field, a field beneath an impossible sky. The clouds above churned in slow, unnatural spirals, deep violet, streaked with red, shifting like ink spreading through water. A dull, golden light pulsed at the horizon, illuminating the field of tall, black grass swaying without wind. The door shut behind me. I turned sharply. It was gone. The breath in my throat turned to ice. Then I heard it. The sound of pages turning, not from a book, from all around me, the grass. Each blade wasn't grass at all. They were pages. Thousands upon thousands of pages, filled with names, shifting words, rewriting themselves. The entire field was a breathing, living archive. And I was standing in the middle of it. I knelt, hesitating before touching one of the blades. My fingers grazed the paper, and the ink bled into movement. My heart stopped. It was my name, my book, and it was still writing itself. But before I could read further, the whispers returned. Low, murmuring, rising in a strange, melodic chant. From the other figures standing in the field. I hadn't noticed them before. Shadows between the pages half-formed, some standing, some hunched, their faces obscured. But I knew they were looking at me. I swallowed back a scream. Then one of them moved. The figure closest to me shifted, its silhouette bending unnaturally. No face, no features, just a dark, wavering outline against the field of shifting pages. But it knew me. I felt it before I heard it, a whisper, low and stretched, like ink bleeding through fabric. "You do not belong here." The words didn't come from a mouth. They formed in the air, pressing against my skin like damp paper. I fought the urge to turn and run, but I had no idea which direction was safe. The other figures moved too, their presence thickening the air. Then, a sound rippled through the field. A page turning, but not just any page. I looked down. It was my book. The ink rearranged itself faster now, as if something was writing my fate in real time. Line by line, the last sentence solidified before my eyes. They see him now. They know what he is. My heart slammed against my ribs. I took a step back. The nearest figure mimicked me, tilting its head in a motion too slow, too deliberate. The ink on my page changed again. Run. I didn't question it. I turned and bolted through the field of whispering pages, the shadows moving with me. The further I ran, the more the sky twisted, the deep violet clouds thickening like smoke. The golden light on the horizon flickered, pulsing faster, as if responding to my movement. I didn't dare look back, but I felt them closing in. The air around me crackled. The paper beneath my feet shifted. And then I saw it, a structure standing alone in the field, not a door, not a house, a library, but not the one I had walked into. This one was older, much older. The stonework was weathered, vines twisting over the grand, rotting doors. Its windows were dark, empty sockets staring at me, and then I realized it was waiting for me. I stopped just short of the massive structure, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ancient library loomed before me, its towering stone walls cracked with age, veins of darkness crawling through the fractures. The air around it felt heavier, charged with something unnatural. Behind me, the shadows whispered. Not words this time, but something deeper. A pressure in my skull, like fingers pressing against my thoughts. I hesitated only for a moment. Then I threw myself forward, pushing against the massive wooden doors. They groaned open, dust billowing from the gap like breath from a sleeping beast. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of aged parchment and something rotting. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, vanishing into darkness. Rows upon rows of bookshelves lined the walls, spiraling upward in an architecture that defied reason. This wasn't just a library, it was a labyrinth, a place untouched by time, yet filled with the echoes of stories that had never been told. The doors slammed shut behind me. I turned, my pulse hammering. The shadows that had chased me were gone. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the farthest aisle, not a shadow, not a faceless thing like the ones outside. A man, or at least something shaped like one. He was tall and thin, dressed in a tattered black coat that dragged along the floor. His head tilted ever so slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And then he spoke. "You are not supposed to be here." His voice was low, but it wasn't a warning. It was a fact. I swallowed hard, forcing my shaking hands to stay at my sides. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's hollow eyes settled on me, his expression unreadable. Then, without answering, he raised one hand, a single, bony finger pointing toward the nearest shelf. I followed his gesture and saw it, a book, bound in black leather, old and cracked. The title was scrawled in silver lettering. My name. I took a step closer. The ink on the cover shifted, moving as if alive. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. But before I could touch it, the man spoke again. "Are you certain you wish to know?" A cold dread settled deep in my bones. I wasn't sure anymore, but it was too late, because the book was already opening. The pages fluttered open on their own, as if caught in a sudden wind. I hadn't even touched it. The ink on the paper swirled and twisted, forming words before my eyes, my story, my fate. I held my breath as the first line appeared. "You were never supposed to find this place." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the strange man in the tattered black coat. He hadn't moved. His hollow gaze remained fixed on me, as if he was waiting for something. More words scrawled onto the page, but now that you have the library must decide. Decide what? I whispered, but the book wasn't finished. The ink twisted again. Will you leave as you came, or will you stay and become a story yourself? My pulse thundered in my ears. A choice, was it really a choice? I didn't know what would happen if I stayed. I didn't even know what becoming a story meant. But I knew what happened to people who tried to run from fate. I had read enough of these books to understand. I turned the page, it was blank. I ran my fingers over the parchment, half expecting it to crumble at my touch, but it felt firm. Waiting, why is it empty? I asked. The man in the coat finally moved. He reached toward the shelf and pulled out another book. It looked exactly like mine, same black leather, same shifting silver title. But this one had been written through. And then I saw the name on the cover. I almost dropped my own book. It was my grandfather's name, the same grandfather who had vanished without a trace 50 years ago. I turned to the man in horror. He was here. My voice cracked. The man's lips barely moved. He still is. I took a step back, gripping the book tightly. The ink on the blank page began to move again. You do not leave this place unchanged. The lights above flickered. A whisper curled around my ears, though no one had spoken. Choose. I realized then that the book was waiting. Waiting for me to write the next line. Waiting for me to decide my own fate. And deep in my gut, I knew. Once I made a choice, I could never undo it. The book trembled in my hands. It wanted me to write. But what would happen if I did? I looked at my grandfather's book, the one fully written, sealed by fate. He had disappeared half a century ago, and now, standing in this cursed library, I had a gut-wrenching feeling that his story had never truly ended. He still is. That's what the man in the coat had said. I swallowed hard, my fingers tracing the edges of the empty page. Was he trapped here? Had he become one of the stories lining these shelves? I turned to the mysterious figure beside me. What happened to him? I asked. The man's expression remained unreadable, but he reached out, flipping through my grandfather's book with an eerie reverence. The pages turned rapidly, stopping just before the final one. I stared at the last line written in ink. He made a choice. The rest of the page was empty. I felt something cold press against my spine, a presence, unseen but suffocating. The lights overhead dimmed, and the rows of bookshelves seemed to stretch further, their edges blurring like a mirage. A new sentence appeared in my own book, scrawling itself in shaking ink, and now, so must you. The pen in my hand twitched. I don't want to write it, I whispered. The man in the coat finally spoke. His voice was slow, deliberate, and far too calm. Then the library will write for you. I turned the page. Words had already started forming. A story was being written without my control. My breathing turned shallow. I forced my gaze downward, watching as the ink curled into existence. He took a step back, but the floor was no longer solid beneath his feet. The library had made its choice. No. I snapped the book shut. The lights flickered violently. The shelves groaned, shifting as if something was stirring inside them. A deep hum vibrated through the floor, through my bones. I wasn't just reading a story. I was inside one. And the library had already begun to write my ending. I had to make a choice before it finished the story for me. I gripped the book tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. The words on the page had stopped forming, but I knew better. The library wasn't done with me. The man in the coat stood still, watching, waiting. What happens if I refuse to be written? I asked, voice hoarse. He tilted his head, as if considering the question for the first time. Then, slowly, he reached up and pulled a book from a nearby shelf. It was dusty, the edges frayed with age. He handed it to me without a word. I hesitated before flipping it open. No title, no name, just a single sentence on the first page. The story of the one who tried to leave. I turned the page. There were no words, just long, deep scratches carved into the paper, like something had tried to claw its way out. The book screamed. I dropped it, stumbling back as it hit the ground with a sickening thud. The moment it landed, the shelves around us lurched. Books toppled, dust exploded into the air, and then I saw it, a door. It hadn't been there before, tall. iron and pulsing like a heartbeat. My grandfather's book still lay open beside me, its final sentence glowing like fresh ink. He made a choice. I had to make mine. The man in the coat stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "You don't have much time." I looked at the book in my hands, then at my grandfather's story, then at the door. Somewhere deep in the library, something growled. I exhaled sharply and took a step forward. Toward the door that shouldn't exist, Nate stood frozen, the dim glow of his flashlight flickering against the towering bookshelves of the Library of Unwritten Deaths. The silence was unnerving, thick like a heavy fog, pressing against his ears. Every book in this place held a fate, some complete, some still unfolding, but his own was the one that mattered most now. He ran his fingers along the spine of Nathaniel Carter, a death unwritten, hesitating before pulling it from the shelf. The book felt warm, almost pulsing, as if it were alive. The last time he had read it, the pages were shifting, rewriting his destiny in real time. But what if it had changed again? He inhaled sharply and cracked it open. The ink on the newest page bled as if freshly written. The path forward is veiled in shadows, but beyond the final shelf, the truth waits to be unearthed. Nate's pulse quickened. The final shelf. What did that mean? His mind raced as he scanned the room, his eyes locking onto a peculiar shelf at the very end of the corridor. One that seemed older than the others, its wood worn and splintered. As he approached, he noticed something odd, a faint draft. He reached out, pressing against the shelf, and felt it shift slightly. A hidden door. His heart pounded as he pushed harder. With a groaning creak, the entire bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passage. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying the scent of aged paper and something else, something metallic, like blood. He hesitated only for a moment before stepping in, his flashlight casting long, distorted shadows on the stone walls. The passage stretched ahead, winding deeper into the unknown. Somewhere in the darkness, something moved. A whisper, a shuffle of footsteps. Nate gripped his flashlight tighter. He wasn't alone. Nate's breath came shallow as he moved cautiously down the hidden passage, the damp stone walls pressing in around him. His flashlight cast a narrow beam, flickering as if struggling against an unseen force. The scent of old paper and something metallic, blood perhaps, grew stronger. A whisper drifted through the tunnel. "You shouldn't be here." Nate's spine stiffened. The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakably real. He swung the flashlight wildly, illuminating nothing but the ancient walls and the dust particles swirling in the stagnant air. Then footsteps, light, deliberate, just ahead. Nate hesitated, gripping his book tighter. He knew better than to call out. Instead, he pressed forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. The passage turned sharply, and suddenly, he found himself standing at the entrance of a vast underground chamber. Rows upon rows of bookshelves stretched before him, but these were different. Unlike the meticulously organized shelves of the main library, these were in complete disarray, some toppled over, pages scattered across the stone floor. And at the center of it all stood a figure, a woman. Her back was turned, her long dark hair cascading down her tattered dress. She stood completely still, as if listening. Nate swallowed hard. "Who are you?" His voice was barely above a whisper. The woman didn't move, didn't react. Nate took a slow step forward. Are you a librarian?" The moment the words left his mouth, the woman's head snapped toward him. But not all the way. Just slightly, as if her neck were restrained by some unseen force. Then she spoke. "They never leave, neither will you." The flashlight flickered violently. The ground beneath Nate shuddered. The books on the shelves began to move. Pages fluttered, ink bleeding off the paper, as if the words themselves were coming to life. A low hum filled the air, growing into a deafening roar. And then the woman turned fully. Nate barely had time to scream. The scream died in Nate's throat as his flashlight flickered, and the woman's face came into view. But it wasn't a face at all. Where her features should have been, there was nothing but blank, pale skin smooth and empty, as if someone had erased her existence. Nate stumbled backward, his breath ragged. His fingers tightened around the book in his hand, the one with his name, still unfinished, still changing. The woman took a slow step toward him, her movements eerily fluid, like she was gliding rather than walking. The books around them trembled, their pages flipping on their own, words twisting and shifting into new sentences. "You shouldn't have come here." Her voice was soft, but it echoed in the cavernous chamber as if a dozen voices spoke at once. Nate swallowed hard. "Who are you?" His voice was barely steady. The woman paused. Then, for the first time, her face began to change. Beneath the smooth skin, shadows rippled, pushing outward, shaping themselves into a nose, lips, hollow eyes, his eyes. It was his own face staring back at him. Nate's breath hitched. "You don't belong here," she whispered. "But now you are part of the story." The moment she spoke, the book in Nate's hands burned red, hot. He gasped, dropping it. The moment it hit the ground, the pages burst into motion, flipping wildly, ink bleeding and rearranging itself. Then, all at once, the pages stopped, and Nate saw the words that had just written themselves onto the last page. Nathaniel Carter was never seen again. His stomach twisted. No, this couldn't be happening. The woman, his reflection, tilted her head. "You must run," she whispered. "Before it's too late." The ground trembled. The bookshelves groaned and shifted, the cavern closing in around him. From the shadows, a chorus of whispers rose, murmuring his name over and over. Nate didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. Nate's pulse thundered in his ears as he sprinted through the shifting labyrinth of bookshelves. The air smelled of aged paper and ink, but beneath it was something else, something rotten, something wrong. The shelves weren't just moving, they were watching him. As he darted past rows of books, he noticed the spines shifting, letters rearranging themselves into words. His words. They were writing his story in real time. Nathaniel Carter ran through the endless corridors, his breath short, his body trembling. But no matter how fast he moved, he could feel it behind him, the faceless thing, watching, waiting. He gasped and turned away, shoving a book off the shelf as he ran. It hit the floor with a deafening thud. And then something whispered his name, Nathaniel. He stopped, his entire body rigid with terror. The voice hadn't come from behind him. It had come from inside the shelves. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head. The books were shifting again. Some slid back, revealing small gaps in the shelves, dark spaces, hollow voids. And inside them eyes, hundreds of them, blinded, milky white, staring directly at him. Nate stumbled backward, his foot catching on a fallen book. His body crashed to the ground, but before he could move, the whispering grew louder. The eyes blinked in unison, the air humming with some unseen force. The shelves started to bend toward him, reaching, stretching. The books along their spines peeled open on their own, fluttering like the wings of dying birds. And then a hand emerged, not human, too long, too thin, fingers that bent at impossible angles, stretching toward him with claw-like precision. Nate scrambled to his feet and ran, but the bookshelves were closing in. He reached the end of an aisle, only to see the passage ahead slam shut as two shelves twisted together. He was trapped. The whispering turned into something worse, laughter. Soft at first, then louder. Every book was laughing at him. Desperate, Nate turned to the nearest shelf, scanning for anything that could help him. And then he saw it. A book with no title. Its cover was a deep, midnight black, ink bleeding from its edges. It was unlike anything else in the library. And something inside him knew this book was meant for him. He reached for it, his hands shaking. The moment his fingers touched the cover, a cold shock surged through his body, and everything went dark. The laughter stopped, the whispering ceased, the air was still. Then, in the silence, a page turned, and a voice not his own began to read. Darkness swallowed Nate whole, not the absence of light, but something deeper, something alive. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had eyes anymore, or a body. Then a page turned. A voice, smooth and steady, filled the void. Nathaniel Carter pressed his trembling fingers against the cover of the untitled book, not knowing it would be the last thing he'd ever touch as himself. Nate's breath hitched. That voice, it wasn't coming from the book. It was coming from everywhere. His limbs jerked, his body no longer his own. The darkness around him flickered, and suddenly light. Dim, flickering candlelight. A wooden table beneath his palms. Stacks of books surrounding him in neat, careful piles. Nate looked down. The untitled book was open in front of him. Its pages were blank. Then, ink bled onto the paper, forming words before his eyes. Nathaniel Carter sat at the old wooden desk, his breath shallow as he realized the truth. He was no longer outside the story. He was inside it. No. Panic clawed at his chest. He slammed the book shut and stumbled to his feet. The room was small, windowless, with towering bookshelves caging him in. The air smelled of wax and dust, old paper, and something sour, something like decay. A single wooden door stood at the far end of the room. He lunged for it, his fingers curling around the handle, locked. A slow, deliberate page turned behind him. Nate whipped around. The book had opened again, more words. Nathaniel Carter ran for the door, but it would not open. The library did not let its stories leave so easily. His heart hammered. He wasn't writing this. Something else was. His hands balled into fists. No, this was a dream. It had to be. He just needed to wake up. He squeezed his eyes shut. Wake up, wake up. Another page turned. Nathaniel Carter squeezed his eyes shut, desperate to wake from the nightmare. But there was no waking from a place that had already written him in. The ink pulsed on the page as though breathing. Nate took a slow step back, his throat dry. Then he noticed something else. A quill sat beside the book. Not a pen, not a pencil, a quill. Its tip glistened not with ink, with blood. And then the whispering returned, soft, sinister, hungry. Nathaniel, pick up the pen. A shadow flickered across the wall. The book turned another page, and on the blank paper, fresh words wrote themselves in looping, delicate script. It's your turn to write, Nathaniel. His fingers twitched because deep down, something in him knew. If he didn't, the book would write the rest for him. Nate's fingers trembled as he stared at the blood-tipped quill. It sat beside the book like a poised serpent, waiting to strike. The words on the page glistened, fresh and alive. It's your turn to write, Nathaniel. The ink pulsed like a beating heart. He shook his head, backing away. No, I didn't come here for this. I just wanted to return the book. His voice sounded thin, hollow, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Another page turned, his breath caught. Nathaniel Carter refused to write. The library did not like refusals. The candlelight flickered. The shadows on the walls moved, slithering like ink spreading through water. Something was watching him. A whisper close to his ear, "Write." A sudden, piercing pain shot through his hand. Nate gasped, clutching his palm. A thin cut had appeared across his skin, like an invisible blade had slashed him. Blood welled up, dripping onto the book's empty page. The ink absorbed it. The shadows on the walls stirred. The book turned another page. Nathaniel Carter bled onto the page, and the library accepted his offering. But the story still needed to be written. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. This wasn't just a book. It was something else, something that could hear him, see him, control him. And it wanted him to obey. A slow, agonizing minute passed. Then, from deep within the library, came a sound. Footsteps, not the librarian's, heavier, slower. Each step was deliberate, like something massive was approaching. Nate turned toward the door, still locked. The shadows on the walls twisted, stretching unnaturally. They pooled together, forming something tall, something wrong. A shape emerged, humanoid, but distorted. Limbs too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes that didn't exist, and yet it was staring directly at him. "Right, Nathaniel." The voice slithered through the air like an echo of something ancient. The quill trembled on the table. Nate's mind screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps grew louder. He had seconds to decide. Write or face whatever was coming. His fingers reached for the quill. The ink shimmered. The shadows closed in. And as the first word spilled from the tip onto the page, the library whispered, "Good choice." The bookstore had never felt this claustrophobic before. The shelves loomed overhead like silent witnesses, their spines unreadable in the dim glow of the flickering lanterns. Every step I took echoed through the hollow corridors of books, books that whispered, books that waited. In my trembling hands, I clutched the volume that bore my name. The pages had begun to change again, words scrawling across them, as if written by an unseen hand. My pulse thundered in my ears as I forced myself to read. Your time is measured not in years, but in turns of a page, and there is only one left. I felt the weight of that statement settle over me like a death sentence, but something was different this time. The ink, normally deep black, was now a dark crimson, almost as if the book bled. Across the room, the old librarian stood motionless. Her thin fingers, pale as parchment, clutched another book tightly against her chest. It was unfamiliar, one I hadn't seen before, but as she took a step forward, the candlelight caught the cover, and I saw it clearly. It was his name. The stranger, the one who had been rewriting my fate. My breath hitched as she opened the book, revealing the unfinished script inside. The words unraveled like a prophecy being fulfilled in real time. My own name was interwoven in his story, tangled with his own demise. If he had been controlling my fate, then could I, somehow, control his. A realization dawned. I didn't have to be just a reader. I could be the writer. The room seemed to pulse with new energy. The walls shuddered, books rattling against their shelves. The stranger was near. I could feel his presence like a shadow stretching toward me. This was it, the moment where fate could be rewritten. I reached for the quill lying on the table, dipping it into the ink that shimmered ominously under the candlelight. If I could write him out, if I could end his story first, then maybe, just maybe, I could escape mine. But as the tip of the quill touched the page, I heard it, a whisper, a breath, not from the librarian. Not from me, from the book itself, and then the candlelight went out. Darkness swallowed the bookstore whole. The last flicker of candlelight vanished, leaving only the scratch of unseen movement in the suffocating void. My pulse hammered in my throat as I clutched the quill, its tip hovering over the cursed page that carried my fate. Then the whisper came again, closer this time. You cannot erase what is already written. The voice slithered through the blackness, neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was something ancient, something that had lived through the turning of countless pages. I forced a breath and steadied my trembling hands. The book before me still bore my name, the ink shifting like a living thing. But now, another book was open across the table, the stranger's. His fate, too, was incomplete. My fingers tightened around the quill. If I couldn't erase my own death, I could rewrite his. I pressed the nib to the yellowed paper, forcing the words to take shape beneath my will. The stranger reached for the book, but the ink turned against him. The words he had twisted for so long now twisted him, wrapping around his limbs like black tendrils. The story rejected him, it consumed him, and he was no more. A low hiss filled the air, growing into a guttural snarl. The darkness writhed. The bookstore trembled, and then silence. A cold weight lifted from my chest, like unseen chains breaking. I gasped for breath, feeling the air clear, the space around me shifting. The stranger's book snapped shut, its leather cover splitting with a deep, final crack. The librarian stood across the room, her expression unreadable in the dim glow as the candlelight sputtered back to life. Her gaze flickered toward the book in my hands. My book. Slowly, I turned the pages. The ending had changed. It was no longer a story of doom, but of survival. The final line was etched in fresh ink. The story does not own you. You own the story. A deep exhale shuddered from my lungs. I wasn't free yet, but for the first time I had a choice, and I intended to use it. The bookstore had changed. The oppressive weight that once hung in the air, pressing down on my chest like an invisible hand, had lifted. The flickering candlelight cast long, restless shadows across the endless shelves, but they no longer seemed alive, no longer watched me with unseen eyes. I stood before my book, its pages still warm from the rewritten fate. My hands trembled as I traced the last line with my fingertips. The story does not own you, you own the story. It felt like a lifeline, a rope pulling me from the depths of something ancient and unrelenting. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Behind me, the librarian's heels clicked softly against the wooden floor. "You did something unexpected," she said, her voice like the rustle of brittle pages. The book should not have changed. I turned to face her, half expecting anger or disapproval. Instead, she studied me with something that almost resembled curiosity. "I rewrote my own ending," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Doesn't that mean I'm free?" The librarian tilted her head. "Free?" She let the word hang in the air like a loose thread. "No one who enters the library of unwritten deaths ever truly leaves." My stomach twisted, but I changed the story. The stranger. "He's gone. I saw his book close." "You did." The librarian stepped closer, her dark eyes fixed on me, "but something else will take his place." A slow, cold realization crept over me. "You mean me?" The librarian didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and ran her fingers along the spine of my book, as if feeling for something unseen. "The library exists to balance the unwritten fates," she murmured. "A name removed, a name added. That is how it has always been." "No." I took a step back, shaking my head. "That's not fair." She sighed, her expression almost pitying. "Fairness has no place here." The book in my hands felt heavier now, the ink within its pages shifting restlessly. A slow, creeping horror settled over me as I realized what I had done. By changing my fate, I had disrupted the natural order. And something had to fill the void. The bookstore groaned, the very walls seeming to breathe. The shelves shuddered as if in anticipation. My pulse pounded as the flickering candles dimmed, their light retreating toward the edges of the room. I turned toward the door, the exit I had once longed for. It was still there, still open, but a deep, instinctual dread told me that if I walked through it, I wouldn't leave as the same person. I wasn't escaping the library, I was becoming part of it. The librarian took a step back, fading into the shadows, her presence melting into the very essence of the bookstore. "You have a choice," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the hum of shifting pages. "Close the book and accept what you've rewritten, or leave, and let the library claim you in ways you do not yet understand." I swallowed hard. The candlelight flickered. The door loomed before me. My book lay heavy in my hands, ink still shifting restlessly within its pages. I had changed the ending, but was it truly mine? The door stood open, a dark passage leading back to the world I had once known. But the weight in my hands, the book bearing my name, felt heavier than ever. The ink inside still moved, shifting like restless tides, refusing to settle into the finality of an ending. I could walk through the door. I could step into the world outside, breathe fresh air, feel the wind on my skin. But the librarian's words clung to me like cobwebs. No one who enters the library of unwritten deaths ever truly leaves. I glanced back at her, but she was already dissolving into the dim light, her silhouette blending with the countless shelves stretching into infinity. The bookstore itself seemed to pulse, its ancient presence watching, waiting. A deep unease curled in my gut. What happens if I walk through that door? My voice was barely a whisper. The librarian's reply came as a murmur, laced with something almost like sorrow. "You'll leave this place, but you won't leave behind its mark." My grip tightened on the book, and if I stay, a pause. Then you'll understand. The silence that followed was deeper than before. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my decision. I turned back to the book in my hands. The cover, once pristine, now looked different. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled 1,000 times before. The title had changed too, The Storyteller of Unwritten Deaths. My breath caught in my throat. I flipped open the first page. Instead of my past, the ink revealed something else, something new. A name I didn't recognize. A fate I had never seen before. The ink bled into paragraphs, shifting into a story that was still forming. It wasn't mine anymore. It was someone else's. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized the truth. I had not rewritten my ending. I had inherited the beginning of another. The door before me no longer seemed like an escape. The thought of stepping through it, returning to my old life, felt wrong. Had I ever really belonged to that life at all? A slow breath escaped me. I let my fingers trace the pages, feeling the pull of something vast and unseen. This was the price of a rewritten fate, not freedom, purpose. The bookstore's shelves stretched on, filled with untold stories, with lives hanging in the balance. And in my hands was the first of many. The library had chosen me, or maybe I had chosen it. The ink on the page had finally settled. The letters, once shifting and unstable, were now firm, etched into the yellowed parchment, as if they had always been there. My name was gone. In its place, a new title stared back at me, The Storyteller of Unwritten Deaths. Beneath it, a single name was written, Daniel Whitmore. I swallowed hard. The moment I read it, something in the air shifted, like the room itself had exhaled. The bookstore's endless shelves stretched around me, whispering with stories not yet told. But this was mine to read. I hesitated, fingers brushing the page. What would happen if I turned it? Would I be an observer, a witness, or something far worse? The librarian had disappeared, leaving me alone with the book, the choice, and the heavy sense that this was only the beginning. Slowly, I turned the page. Daniel Whitmore, 47 years old. That was all the first line said. But the ink was still fresh, still moving slightly, as if waiting for me to absorb the words before continuing. A second line appeared beneath it, forming in real time. Daniel Whitmore will die in exactly 1 hour. My blood ran cold. I slammed the book shut. The whispering shelves went silent, as if the library itself was watching, waiting for my reaction. 1 hour, a stranger. Someone I had never met was going to die in just 60 minutes, and I was the one meant to read it. No, not just read it, witness it. A deep, hollow fear settled into my bones. What was I supposed to do with this? I looked at the door again, the only way out of the bookstore, the one the librarian had warned me about. But what if there was another way? What if I could change it? I hesitated only for a moment before flipping the book open again. The ink was still moving, forming words. The next sentence chilled me to my core. Daniel Whitmore's fate is still unwritten. But it will be soon. I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was real, and if it was unwritten, then maybe, just maybe, I had the power to change it. The book trembled in my hands, the ink shifting across the aged pages like living shadows. Daniel Whitmore's fate is still unwritten, but it will be soon. The weight of those words sent a deep shudder through me. I had assumed these books only foretold death, that they were nothing more than eerie, predestined scripts, dictating the inevitable. But this was different. If fate was truly unwritten, did that mean I had a choice? The room around me felt smaller, the bookshelves towering like walls of an inescapable labyrinth. The flickering lanterns above dimmed slightly, and for the first time, I felt something beyond fear, responsibility. Daniel Whitmore wasn't just a name in a book. He was a real person, breathing, living, and waiting. I swallowed hard. 1 hour, I needed to find him. I shot to my feet, gripping the book tightly as I rushed toward the front desk. The librarian, I whispered under my breath. Where had she gone? The counter was empty, the bell on the desk eerily still. Behind it, the doorway leading to the back room gaped open like a mouth. Had she known what I would find? Had she disappeared on purpose? I scanned the room, heart pounding. Daniel Whitmore. I muttered, "How do I find you?" Then I felt it. A tug, Not physical, not like hands pulling at me. Something deeper, something unseen. The book in my hands grew warm, the edges curling slightly as if responding to my thoughts. It wanted me to go. I had no idea where, but I followed. The front door of the bookstore should have led outside, to the rainy street I had entered from. But when I pushed it open, the air beyond was different. No rain, no city. Instead, I stepped into a dimly lit alleyway, the smell of damp brick and faint cigarette smoke hanging in the air. A neon sign flickered at the end of the narrow passage, casting long, broken shadows. This wasn't where I had come from. The bookstore had changed its door again, and it had placed me exactly where I needed to be. A man stood at the far end of the alley, his back to me. He was hunched slightly, checking his phone, completely unaware that fate, or something close to it, had brought me here. Daniel Whitmore, the name pulsed in my mind like an echo. I took a breath. If I had 1 hour to change his fate, I had to act now. But before I could take another step, the book's pages flipped on their own. New words appeared in black ink, burning themselves onto the parchment like a warning. Daniel Whitmore's fate is no longer unwritten. His story is now yours. A chill crawled up my spine. I looked back toward Daniel, and for the first time he turned and stared directly at me. His face was blank, emotionless, and in his hand he wasn't holding a phone anymore. He was holding a book, one with my name on it. Daniel Whitmore's stare was empty, too empty, the kind of blankness that sent a primal warning through my mind, telling me that something was wrong. I had come looking for him, but now, standing at the end of the alley, he was waiting for me. The book in his hands looked identical to mine. Aged leather cover, thick yellowed pages. But when I focused on the lettering embossed on the spine, my breath caught in my throat. Daniel Whitmore wasn't holding his book. He was holding mine. A low hum filled the air between us, a vibration I could feel in my ribs. The neon sign above flickered wildly, casting broken red light over his unmoving face. He raised the book and opened it. I took a slow step forward, my own book still gripped in my hands, but something inside me screamed to stop. "What?" I started, but the moment I spoke, Daniel's expression changed. His lips twisted into something that was almost a smile, but not quite. Like his face didn't understand how to form it correctly. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured. The pages of my book flipped on their own, as if invisible hands were turning them. My name was scrawled across them in thick, wet ink. The sentences they were still writing themselves. Daniel Whitmore's fate is no longer unwritten. His story is now yours. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my throat. "I don't understand," I said. "The book. It told me you only had an hour. I came to find you, to stop it." Daniel gave a slow, unnatural tilt of his head. "Stop what?" The pages turned faster. Words appeared as we spoke. I looked down at them, my breath catching as I read the newest lines. The seeker arrived, believing they could change fate, but they never realized fate had already changed them. I swallowed hard. "No," I whispered. Daniel took a step closer. He shut the book with a loud snap, and everything around me changed. I wasn't in the alley anymore. The brick walls had melted away, replaced by towering wooden shelves I recognized. I was back in the bookstore. The scent of aged paper and candle wax filled my lungs. The flickering lanterns above swayed gently, casting strange, shifting shadows. But something was wrong. The counter was gone, the doors gone. The entire front of the store had disappeared. And the books, every single one was blank. I turned in a slow, panicked circle. The store had always felt like it existed outside of reality, but now it felt wrong. Like I had stepped into an unfinished sketch, a hollow version of where I had once been. I clutched the book to my chest. The title on the front had changed. It no longer said Daniel Whitmore. Now it bore my name and the pages. Still unwritten, a sound echoed from the back of the store. A slow, deliberate footstep. I turned sharply, heart pounding, as a shadow moved between the shelves. Not the librarian, not Daniel, something else, something that had been waiting for me. The footsteps continued slow, deliberate, heavy. I backed away, pressing myself against the nearest shelf, my fingers tightening around the book in my hands. The pages still shifted beneath my grip, writing themselves in real time. I didn't want to look. I had to look. The seeker stands at the threshold of an unwritten fate. The next step will decide how their story ends. My breath hitched. A shadow passed between the shelves, a figure moving with an unnatural grace, tall, silent, watching. "Who are you?" My voice barely left my throat. The figure did not answer. Instead, it took another step closer. I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing against reality itself, bending the air between us. The scent of old parchment and candle smoke twisted into something else, something rancid. It wasn't just watching me. It was waiting for me to understand. My grip tightened around the book. If I ran, would it follow? If I stayed, would I become just another unfinished story? I turned back to the pages, desperately searching for an answer. The ink was still forming, shifting, rewriting. And then the words changed. The seeker understands too late. They were never reading the story, they were writing it. My pulse hammered against my skull. No, that wasn't right. I had been following the words, following the warnings, not creating them. Right, the figure moved, a blur of motion, closing the space between us in an instant. I gasped, stumbling backward, my back hitting the towering shelves behind me. It reached out long, spindly fingers stretching toward the book in my hands, and then I saw. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't even human. The space where its face should have been shifted like ink in water. Faint outlines of features surfaced: eyes, a mouth, a nose. But they were mine. It wasn't watching me. It was becoming me. The pages flipped violently, stopping on the final one. There was only one sentence left. The seeker makes a choice. My breath was ragged. The ink quivered, waiting for me, waiting for my decision to take form. And I realized I was never meant to finish Daniel's story. I was meant to finish mine. The seeker makes a choice. I ripped the page from the book. The figure reeled back, its faceless form rippling in agony. A scream, silent but deafening, shook the walls of the bookstore. The lanterns above exploded in a shower of sparks. The shelves groaned and collapsed inward, pulling themselves into nothingness. The book in my hands burned, the world around me fractured, and then I woke up. I was lying on the cold tile floor of my apartment, the dim glow of the city pressing through the blinds. My hands trembled as I pushed myself up, my breath ragged. There was no bookstore, no bookshelves, no shifting figures. Just me, and the single page clutched in my fingers. I looked down at it. The ink was still wet. The final sentence had changed. The seeker wakes up, but the story is never truly over. I swallowed hard. Somewhere in the distance, a soft rustling sound filled the silence, pages turning. I turned toward the source and froze. On my desk, a book sat where there had been none before. A book I knew too well. A book with my name on it.